Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation, 5 Considerations for Cloud Faxing. We have a lot of information to get through today in our presentation, but I wanted to point out real quick on your screen, you should see the GoToWebinar control panel and the questions box within that control panel. I'd invite you to ask your questions at any time along the way in the presentation, and if we can answer them on the spot, we will certainly try to do that. If we aren't able to do that, we'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. And of course, if we run out of time and we aren't able to answer your specific question, we will definitely have somebody reach out to you directly and make sure you get the information that you need. So I am very happy to be joined today by my colleagues David Angelitis and Juan Cueva. David is the Director of Sales for Instant Infosystems, and Juan Cueva is the Director of Technical Services at Instant Infosystems. And both David and Juan are longtime fax industry veterans, and between the two of them have helped literally countless companies, hundreds of companies, move their traditional fax server environment into a cloud fax solution. So before we get started, we wanted to talk a little bit about cloud computing. An interesting article from ZDNet earlier this year stated that cloud computing will virtually replace traditional data centers within 3 years. So think about that time period of 3 years. That is literally no time at all, a blink of an eye. And chances are your organization has a cloud computing initiative already. But the question is, does that cloud computing initiative include fax? And if it doesn't, it definitely should. Earlier this, or actually just last month, business.com had another interesting article about cloud fax services and said cloud fax services increase security, speed up the transmission of information, help with archiving and filing, reduce an organization's paper footprint, and decrease maintenance costs. So clearly there are plenty of really good reasons to move your fax environment into the cloud. But the question is how to do that and when to do it and what is the right way to do it. And we talk to dozens of customers every day who are thinking about moving their fax environment to the cloud but are not quite sure how to do that. So if we take a look at the key areas that our customers have the most concerns, it's pretty consistently falling into 5 buckets: security and compliance and reliability, integrations, cost, of course, is always a key concern. The actual transition process, how do you technically move that transmission from a traditional phone line to a cloud transmission, and what does that mean for users? And then architecture options. There are a number of ways to go about cloud faxing, and the best way may be different for each organization depending on your specific needs and requirements. So that's really what we're going to focus on today, these 5 areas to help you understand what are the things you should be thinking about when you're making the transition into a cloud fax environment, what are the key considerations and questions you should be asking, and then we'll spend some time at the end of the presentation talking about the specific architecture options and which option may be right for you. So with that, I'm very happy to turn it over to my colleague, David Angelitis.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So the first item that we wanted to take a look at was security, compliance, and reliability. This is certainly probably one of the most asked about subjects when it comes to evaluating a cloud fax solution, and rightfully so. Especially in the security and compliance standpoint, I think one of the keys here that we found from helping a lot of customers do this evaluation has been helping the customers actually fully understand their specific requirements when it comes to security and compliance. For example, when we deal with the credit card space, a lot of companies are looking for the PCI level certifications, as well as in the healthcare space, we're seeing customers that are looking to make sure that any of the solutions they use are HIPAA certified, and then also even more recently, high trust certification. One of the keys here, though, that we see, I think, as we talk to different customers about this, is if you really have a requirement that is specific to your organization that you need, I think it's important everyone believes their cloud fax service is secure and offers all of the great benefits that you would need. But what we found is that if it's a true requirement for the business, it's really important that our customers ask for the paperwork. Take a look for the certifications and ask them to be provided. We see a lot of offerings in the marketplace where sometimes the credentialing is self-certified, which I think for our customers they should take with a grain of salt. If it's a true need for the business, ask for those certifications. And what we've seen from vendors that are really taking a look at providing these certifications and compliance requirements, that even if they don't have them in place today, if they are working on those, they are still able to provide letters of engagement from the assessing or credentialing entities that they're working with that show they're engaged. But I would definitely ask for those third-party HIPAA certifications or PCI DSS Level 1 or 3.2, which we have a few folks that are working on now. And I mentioned the letter of engagement also for the high trust component, which is fairly new and kind of an all-encompassing certification in the healthcare space. And it's so new, I don't actually know of any vendors that are currently can check that box and say we are. But we do have several that we are aware of that are in that process and have letters that can attest that they are working on getting that completed. So keep an eye on that if that's a requirement for you. The other piece of this that we see for security and compliance is on the archiving / handling of the faxes that may be stored in the cloud. So I think that's an important piece that when you're looking at these looking at different options in cloud service providers, how are they archiving or handling the data when it's just sitting on their platform? For the easiest answer, many will delete it instantly. But things like the FIPS 140-2 deletion methods and just other key components for how the data is going to be handled once it's outside of your control and hosted in the cloud for you. So the other part of this was reliability. And when it comes to reliability, I think the key benefit here is that for a lot of customers, when you move to the cloud, you are able to eliminate your inbound and outbound capacity constraints. They're typically associated to the on-premise telephony and having a fax board or fax over IP channels that are just physically limited to the number of simultaneous transactions that can be done. So one of the big benefits with this, and we see this used a lot in the cloud faxing space, is offering never busy inbound service, which in a traditional fax server environment, obviously you'd have to add countless numbers of channels until you reach the point where you know you are no longer giving busy signals. And one of the challenges with that we've seen with customers is a lot of times you don't know necessarily when you're giving busy signals because the phone numbers aren't ringing into you. So that's a nice benefit for moving to the cloud. The other big one that we see is kind of along those same lines is just-in-time capacity. And essentially what that refers to is if you were doing large outbound burst or large inbound capacity coming in at key times of the month, a lot of times the cloud service providers are able to scale up to that and make sure that during those high volume times, obviously you're not giving busy signals to your customers, or on the outbound side that you're getting all of those faxes out in a timely manner. The other big benefit here that I think kind of ties into that is having real-time faxing versus store and forward. And this is one of, I think, the key differentiators between a lot of different services that are available. Many of them, unfortunately, do employ the store and forward technology where when you as a customer are sending your fax to the service provider, they are simply queuing those up, and when their bandwidth is available and can handle your fax volume, it will release the jobs. Obviously, if that's the technology they're leveraging for that, there are periods where you could be sending a fax, and from the time that you hit the send button to the time that it actually starts dialing and transmitting to your customer, there could be pretty large gaps there. And so I think when it comes to real-time versus store and forward, obviously there's a very big benefit to real-time if you have SLAs that dictate how quickly you have to respond to requests specifically related to your fax transmissions. So we do see that a lot in the healthcare space where customers have a certain amount of time before they have to reply to certain requests. Also, that holds true, I think, in the the financial services space. So when it comes to the SLAs, I think the important part there is just to do your homework and make sure you understand what are they guaranteeing that they will do, how long will they hold the fax before it goes out, and then if they miss that SLA, what is your recourse? What is the penalty that gets applied? Are you given back a credit? And just making sure that you fully understand what happens if those SLAs are missed, because a lot of times, unfortunately, although we recommend test, and POC like crazy before you move on to anything new, a lot of times these issues aren't uncovered until you're already in full production, and then you start realizing there may be some bandwidth. So always keep an eye on that. And again, not all the cloud fax solutions are created equal. So some of the infrastructures that are set up handle other transmission types beyond fax, for example, SMS and email. And we have seen in some instances where providers that are using their network for additional types of transmissions, if they are overloaded in those other types, it can have an impact on the fax traffic. So if faxing is extremely critical and you don't want to have that potential interference, I think a thing to look out for there is finding a service provider that's really just using or transmitting faxes over their cloud fax service. So the second area of concern that we wanted to talk about today was enterprise integrations. And typically when we talk about enterprise fax integrations, we're referring to automated or production-based fax. And these systems are mission critical to day-to-day operations for our customers and for the businesses that use them. Typically that's because they are associated to driving revenue. So anytime money's involved, you're going to have a lot of eyes on if it's functional or not. A lot of times this is also used to streamline operations, where if you can remove the human factor, obviously system-to-system based faxing can far outpace, from a volume perspective at least, how quickly you can send and receive transmissions. And then in the healthcare space, we see it a lot of times tied directly to providing care. So the ability of the organization to perform their core function can be tied directly to the fax server. And for example, the electronic health record systems are a lot of times set up to send outbound from their interfaces. And when those don't work, we typically spend a lot of time on the phone with our customers trying to figure out what's going on there. Additionally, I think we see too that this is an opportunity for customers to extend both their regular applications, standard things like Oracle, SAP, maybe a finance system, but as well as for homegrown. We'll see a lot of custom applications that get created. And lastly, what we see, I think, specific to this that makes it so important is that they're higher volume. And when you deal with high volume fax, you have the potential for, if it stops working, to become a much larger problem for the customer. So one of the benefits, and this is typically something that when we get into with customers, is we're reviewing the integrations that they have deployed with their legacy system and how they're going to work in the cloud. A lot of times that ends up, I think the conversation starts as it's a concern or maybe a challenge of how we're going to accommodate that. But what we find is that as we get into the details of it and we start outlining how the integration to the cloud is going to work, it ends up being more of a benefit. And really we see an increase in the reliability and the capabilities of the system when it can remove the fax server as a piece of middleware from its ability to send and receive faxes and have the ability to directly integrate to the cloud. So a lot of times we'll see this as the business units get involved and see that, hey, we're going to have a more reliable way for this system to be able to send and receive. And part of that is due to increased access to intelligence is what I'll kind of how I'll classify it. But essentially, when your application is able to bypass the fax server and communicate directly to a cloud fax service, what we found is that customers typically have greater access to more information regarding the status of the transmission, and if it's failed, why exactly did that transmission fail, and having those details passed directly back to the application that was doing the initial delivery. And so a lot of times there's just a reduction in the delay between what the status of the fax is, or if there's been an error and if something needs to be resent. And so compared to a traditional on-premise deployment, we've seen it be, I think, more streamlined and also provide greater SLAs, service levels, and reliability for that application and its ability to send. Additionally, too, one of the things we found with the cloud fax services is that they offer a lot of different integration methods for a customer who wants to integrate their application directly to them, either using SOAP or REST APIs, SMTP, web services. So a lot of times there's a lot of different methods that can be deployed based on what the customer's requirements are and how they want to do that integration. I think recently, or what we see the most of, is taking advantage of the REST APIs. But again, lots of options there to make sure that your development team can really do it any way that they want. And I think, again, the other big part of this, it ultimately comes down to uptime for our customers. And if you're managing an on-premise fax server today, you probably are aware that in a typical fax server deployment, there are a lot of points of failure. Whether it's the SQL database side of things, the storage, the networking, the phone lines, maybe it's the PBXs or the gateways, but there are a long list of items that make a fax server function, and an error or issue in any one of those can actually stop the fax server from functioning at all. And so one of the biggest benefits and the reasons why we've seen so many customers take a look at the direct fax integration recently is that by eliminating all of those potential points of failure from their application's ability to transmit the fax or receive a fax, it just greatly increases their ability to provide the service that they're trying to provide to their users. So the third item that we spend a lot of time on with customers for sure is cost and return on investment. When it comes to ROI, ideally, I think a lot of customers look at this and go in with the mindset of, yeah, great, let's move it to the cloud. We're going to save a ton of money. And that certainly can be the case in some instances, because there's a lot of areas that when you move it to the cloud, as I was talking about for the enterprise integrations, a traditional on-premise fax server has a lot of components that are required in order to make it function properly. And then if you do that in a highly available or a DR architecture, you double all of that. So when you look at removing all of those pieces, the phone lines, the gateways, PBX, Avaya, Cisco routers, whatever you may be using, as well as the fax cards themselves, or if you're using fax over IP, there's software licenses that are required to perform that functionality. So there are a lot of pieces that you potentially have the capability of taking off the table and realizing cost savings with. Additionally, usually customers see a greater increase in uptime and reliability from disaster recovery and overflow capabilities. As I talked about a little bit earlier, in the traditional on-premise method, you have to have channels in order to scale and deal with large peak burst or volumes, as well as if you have heavy inbound. And a lot of times that may be a very rare occurrence that happens only once a month or even less. But if you wanted to be able to not have busy signals or have fax queues build up and have long delays, you obviously have to purchase a bunch of additional channel licensing in order for the system to accommodate those peaks. The other big one here that we see is CapEx versus OpEx. For a lot of our customers, it's just simply easier for them to have operating expense that is much lower than the upfront capital expense of a full-blown fax server install, or if you were doing an upgrade to the system that required new hardware, upgrading of the fax boards. So for a lot of our customers, just simply moving to the OpEx model provides a lot of advantages to the business. And then, of course, maintenance and administration cost. For any of you that have support and maintenance, either with us or with other partners, you're probably aware that can be fairly costly on an annual basis. So being able to cross that off can have a considerable impact on the ROI as you evaluate the cloud. And then, of course, the terms and conditions piece of this. A lot of our customers are looking for fax services and are looking at the contracts of, are you going to be tied into a long-term contract, or does the service provider offer short-term or even month-to-month arrangements in case your needs change or in case you start faxing more or stop faxing altogether? So when it comes to the cost analysis, I think the important thing that we see with a lot of customers is there are a lot more considerations than just most of the fax service providers base their charging on a per page cost basis. And the easiest way to look at that is to compare the per page cost versus your telecom bill and the amount of minutes that you're paying. But what we found is that the customers that do that, a lot of times it's going to look like the cloud is much more expensive because if you're not taking into account the additional factors with the hardware and software maintenance, any of the security components that you may pay for with firewalls or additional protection, if you have to encrypt the images when they're sitting on the fax server, if you leave those out, a lot of times this can cause a pretty large imbalance in what the true cost is to the organization for leveraging a cloud fax service. And one of the biggest areas where we see that missed is with the HA and DR. And the emphasis that I put there when we do this exercise with our customers is a lot of times the cloud fax service will provide a much higher service level and reliability and uptime that they're guaranteeing, in addition to the things like the capacity bursting and ability to provide never busy inbound service. And if you wanted to compare an apples to apples when you're looking at the cloud versus your existing infrastructure, I think it's worth the due diligence to look at, well, what do we have to increase with our existing legacy infrastructure to actually make it perform in a comparable manner to what the cloud is offering? And a lot of times if that gets overlooked, it really throws off the comparison, because you're dealing with a system that is providing much greater capability to a system that you may be using that has a lot of limitations. And if you're not capturing the cost of those differences, obviously that's going to change what the cost analysis comes out to at the end. But the other big one on here that I think is difficult to put in a spreadsheet or show customers that we hear of, I think a lot of times after a project is completed, is what I would say time or quality of life. And one of the biggest challenges we face with supporting legacy fax servers with our existing customer base and prospects that we talk to every day is that they experience turnover in their fax server administration team. And that could be from a number of things. Some people just move on to different technologies. Others, just move on entirely. And the challenge with that is that the on-premise fax servers are fairly complicated, and it's a little odd that I feel sometimes I hear it too often, it's just fax. But if you run an on-premise fax system and well, it is just fax until it's not working, and then good luck trying to tell your customers that, hey, don't worry about it not working, it's just fax. And because those infrastructures are complicated and have so many different moving pieces, that when we have new individuals that come on board and start managing and working them, and we have our own internal help desk here where we help troubleshoot those environments, it can cause a lot longer outages and downtimes and frustration as the system doesn't operate properly. And because of that lack of continuity, I think sometimes even our most seasoned administrators that have worked with the systems for years on end, they still end up in situations that leaving them scratching their heads. So I think I'll leave it with this. We have some really excellent tools and some spreadsheets that can help customers with their analysis. But ultimately, what we found, every organization is different. And for some of them, they will see that there are immense savings by moving to a cloud fax service. But for others, it may actually be more expensive. So there is no right answer for either here. And what we found is that even when the cloud fax service may be more expensive on paper, a lot of times our customers will find that the additional benefits can far outweigh that cost and help the business focus more on what their core focus is as opposed to managing a fax application. So I think, if we just run the analyses and find out, where those numbers fall and what's going to be best for each customer. So the fourth area that we wanted to talk about today was ease of transition or migration from your legacy system to a new platform. Obviously, this is an area of great concern for a lot of our customers, as making any change to any system can be concerning. But at Instant Info Systems, we actually have a dedicated team of specialists, specifically fax specialists, who have been supporting on-premise systems as well as deploying cloud-based systems that work with our customers to help make those changes, either upgrading an on-premise to an on-premise or making the switch to a system, or taking an on-premise system and not replacing it, but simply just adding on to that system cloud capabilities, because it does not have to be all or nothing. So we have a tremendous amount of expertise here, and what I'd like to do is introduce my colleague Juan Cueva to talk a little bit about this. Juan is our Director of Technical Services and actually oversees all of the projects that we perform here at Instant Info Systems, both for the on-premise fax server customers as well as for customers that are moving to the cloud. So Juan, if you could take a minute and talk a little bit about transition services, that'd be great.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'll go ahead and go through some of the implementation considerations that many of our customers have gone through, particularly in making their successful transition. So within the transition services here, these are some of the most common questions that come up during our engagement with customers. And they may seem a little elementary here when we take a look at these, but these are great conversation starters with your end users or the departments that are utilizing Fax. So I'll go through each of these here. For discovery, in discovery, we go ahead and review with our customers and go through and understand how users are set up. For example, are jobs getting delivered to email? Are they getting put over to a directory? What are the notifications? Are there delegates that need to be considered? Also with groups, how are the users organized from an administrative perspective, and also if there's any approvals, for example, that need to be done with faxes that are being transmitted. Are phone books being used, and how are those going to be moved over? For example, we have a lot of customers that have ODBC type phone books, and can those be can those work in the cloud? With DAD setup, this is we spend quite a bit of time here with our customers as well to really understand what the individual groups are set up with. Are these set up in under individual groups? Are they set up to department? Where are they getting routed? And in the porting process, we're able to help our customers with that transition and really help them understand how we're going to port them over. Is it all going to happen at once? Are we going to be doing this in phases to transfer the numbers over in phases to a cloud solution, for example? Billing codes. A lot of the cloud solutions actually offer a lot of reporting capabilities, as David was mentioning. What are the reporting capabilities? Because really that's really what billing codes come down to, is are we able to bill, and are we able to see what faxes are being transmitted by which department or which users? And that'll enable you and help you with internal billing. With our dining rules, while these may not be as relevant in the cloud, they are important if you're doing internal routing, for example. So what are the costs, for example, if you're going over the cloud? And if you're doing that internal routing, are those faxes actually, do they need to go through the cloud, or can you continue to do internal routing? So again, in the discovery phase, we go through a process of asking a lot of these questions and really understanding what the capabilities are, and then kind of moving over into what is the best solution for you. Well, a little later in this presentation, we'll be talking about the different types of options there are in cloud faxing. User directories, as we go and evaluate this, for hosted, we can work with customers to export their particular users, and then we provide templates where we're able to successfully import these faxes. For routing purposes and notifications and individuals, as I mentioned before, what are the key pieces for routing, for notifications of these faxes? And are these application-based faxings that are taking place, or desktop faxing? And those notifications need to go to a network directory, for example, back to an application, or do those notifications need to go just to an email, as an example? AD integration is also a consideration. Many of our customers either set up, for example, VPN. Some of the applications that we support SAML authentication, for example, as well, which most customers are moving to as they're moving towards the cloud. It's not just the fax, but it's Active Directory, for example, that may be moved over to the cloud for those application integrations. With network directories, archiving is really the consideration here. Are jobs being held for a long period of time? Do we need to archive, or do we need to integrate into another application for receive faxes into an ECM type of application? And I'll provide just an example here with the flexibility and migration in phases. As I mentioned before, the porting process is an important piece in moving to the cloud if you're going to be moving your numbers. we've had customers where we were working with them on a current upgrade, for example, and either a new requirement may come up, and at that time, it may make sense to implement it into the existing platform. But other times we found that it makes sense to take a look at it and have a direct cloud integration for those requirements. So we can evaluate those with you. Porting, for example, taking longer than expected. We had a customer who we were working with to move them over into cloud solution, and during that time of the transition phase, their existing fax server failed. So we had a need to move them over quicker. So what we did, since the porting was still in process, we provided some test DIDs as an example, and we were able to forward those numbers over to those test DIDs and get them into the solution a lot quicker. So with the capability of having a large capacity, multiple data centers with multiple carriers, we have a lot more flexibility in being able to help our customers in doing so. One other note here on the porting process, and it's a common question that comes up is, when we port these numbers, who owns these numbers? And we work with with all of our providers who will give you the capability of still owning those numbers and having the flexibility of making sure that you always have control of those numbers. Next, I'll go into data migration. So some customers have requirements to keep faxes for a long period of time. Others may need just a confirmation of the fax that it's going out, and others may actually see it as a liability of keeping those faxes. So some customers may actually just want those faxes deleted right away. But from our experience, there are some different options that we have with the aging, with different considerations. Really, from our experience, most customers don't end up migrating the actual fax images. Many times they end up either keeping a cold spare server, basically, or a server in read-only mode, where they can have access to that historical data. Or some customers also have moved the data over, but that's been much less customers that do that. Some cloud solutions have, for example, a default of 365 days that they keep the faxes. As you know, with on-premise solutions, the fax server is not necessarily an archiving solution, but we do have a lot of connection points where we're either able to deliver the job on incoming side to a directory so that they can go into an ECM type solution. We can also, on the outbound side, either record that and route it over to a network directory as well. So we have a lot of different capabilities there with faxing, but those are considerations as well in a lot of the similar questions that are asked with data migration. As we move into integrations, many times this is really the determining factor of what type of architecture makes the most sense for your organization. As David was talking about, many times there are homegrown applications. As we start taking a look at those, whether it's because you're getting those applications up to par with the latest Windows version, .NET version, etc., it's a good time to take a look at those applications and determine whether a direct integration may make the most sense. There are specific integrations with SAP, Founded, and Oracle, and does it make sense at that point to have an on-prem and a hybrid solution? We'll be talking a little bit about that as well here in a little bit. And desktop considerations. What are the desktop considerations? Do your users need more of a feature-rich client with a printer and email integration? So there are some solutions fully hosted where this has worked very well for customers. MFP integrations. With MFP integrations, there are many times where you may have a fax button on your MFP, and those are the direct integrations. Badge readers. Some just integrate via SMTP, for example, with fax number at a specific domain. Those are pretty easy to integrate. But there are many solutions that offer those direct integrations, badge readers, but these are a lot of the questions and considerations that you can take advantage of. Does it route over to an XML and drop a file to either a secure FTP, and then the job is taken from there? But again, the integrations pieces will provide some examples here shortly, where customers have taken a look at these and to really determine, whether the hybrid solution whether hosted or direct integration make the most sense. So David, you want to go ahead and continue on to the next section?
Yeah, perfect. So excellent segue. So what we were going to talk about next is what are these options? And as Juan just highlighted, there are actually three options. But what we look at it when we do this is I think there are a lot of different cloud providers out there, and I separate them into two groups. There's some that focus on the consumer SMB side of things, and then there are other providers that focus in the enterprise. And usually the key difference there is essentially around their scalability, the security and compliance requirements that they have certifications for, and as Juan just mentioned, what they are capable of doing from an integrations perspective. And then, of course, as you add on security, compliance, and integration capabilities, that can change the cost effectiveness of those solutions. So as I talked about earlier on, I think it's really important that we help customers identify exactly what they need. And what we've done is we've actually gone out and evaluated just about as many of the different cloud fax service providers as we possibly could, and have found many of the best of breed offerings that will fit a wide range of customer needs. So let's talk about how we actually choose the right architecture. As Juan just mentioned at the end of his piece, there are three main categories here that we want to take a look at: hybrid, hosted, and direct integration. So let's go ahead and start with the hybrid component first. So hybrid faxing, really what this all boils down to is that you are able to keep your existing fax server and eliminate the phone lines that you use today with that server. So the key benefit here is you're obviously extending the investment of your fax server. Because you still have your fax server, you still have full control over the application software. So you have all of the routing tables, all of the user controls, cover sheets, phone books, everything you have today, including the clients that you may have deployed to your end users, as well as the integrations. So the big benefit to this design, I think, is that from an end user perspective, nothing changes. But on the back end, because we're able to eliminate the phone lines, you have the added benefit of that never busy inbound service, for example. And probably the biggest benefit that we see with this is that the cloud fax providers that offer this hybrid design actually offer multi-carrier backbones. So as opposed to you just having a Verizon PRI, for example, the cloud carriers that provide these hybrid services work with, I think, up to 15, maybe even more, maybe 20, I think, different carriers on their back end, and they have the capability of, if you are sending a fax through their service to a specific number and it's not working, they have the intelligence to be able to route that through a different carrier's network, and they can continue to do that until they find the most successful path. So a lot of times there's some benefit there to being able to, if you're experiencing call failures or transmission-related issues, this is probably the easiest early entry point into leveraging the cloud because you will still have all of your data in-house, so you don't have to worry about any of your faxes being stored in the cloud. And again, as I mentioned before, the interface stays the same for all of your end users. So who's ideally suited for it?
To add to that, David, also, this has been a transition stepping stone, I think, for some of our customers, where you remain with the on-premise application and move the numbers over to the cloud. It gives you, as David was mentioning, a wide range of flexibility with the never busy on the inbound side. And then those numbers are maintained over on the cloud side at that point. And then at a later time, we've seen customers who have actually moved to a fully hosted solution once those numbers are in there. So it kind of gives you a stepping stone over into a fully hosted solution.
Yep, agreed. And I think too, it's again, ideally, we see customers doing this where they're having issues with their phone service. It could be that the carrier is going to discontinue the legacy trunks that you may be using, which are typically the most reliable, so your PRIs and T1s, or even if you have some analog POTS lines, where they're forcing or saying that the customers must utilize SIP. And for customers that have tested that, it has its pluses and minuses, but we have seen some reliability issues in some instances with SIP, and so sometimes that doesn't always play too nicely, and this gives a nice alternative in order to keep the level of service and reliability that the customer is used to having from the transmission side of the house. The other big benefit here is if you don't want to change the end user experience. A lot of times our customers have concern that, are they going to have to learn a new client? Do I have to learn a new admin interface? And they're resistant to those changes. So the hybrid design really gives customers the opportunity to preserve that existing experience that they may be used to, which probably hasn't changed for a long time, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. And then again, the other part of this, I think, is if you're hesitant to store your faxes in the cloud for security reasons or for other reasons, this architectural design obviously affords you the ability to maintain those in-house. And then additionally, all of the normal administration controls that you're used to having with the on-premise fax server. So from an architecture standpoint, this is just a quick diagram to give you an idea how this would work. As I mentioned before, on the left-hand side, you have all of your existing integrations, your email, maybe multifunction devices you have enabled, or your applications that are talking to your fax server. And really the only part that changes is the part at the bottom and to the right, which instead of having the fax server communicate out through your traditional fax board, either through maybe your Cisco or a Viaphone system and then out to the PSTN, all of that simply gets replaced with a secure HTTPS internet connection that allows the fax server to communicate directly to a cloud-based carrier. In the case of this diagram, we have EtherFax on the right providing that service. But they would handle all of the sending and receiving as well as all of the inbound never busy service. And Juan, before we transition to the next one, I know we have deployed hundreds of these, if not more, over the years because this has been available for quite a long time. Is there anything you want to share or add just from your experience deploying this or additional thoughts from customers that are using the technology now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, the on-premise type of application integrations, it gives you the ability to maintain that. We've worked with many customers. It's made it actually very easy for even upgrades also, because on the cloud side, if you are doing an upgrade, all jobs that are still being received can just get queued up in this example on the EtherFax side, and then as soon as that server comes back up, all those jobs get processed right into the system. So it gives a lot of flexibility there, giving you a wider range of telephony. If we've also seen issues with dialing to a specific number, we have a lot more flexibility rather than you having to invest in getting a contract with multiple carriers. You're able to take advantage of the back-end architecture on the telephony side, where we may be able to move a route, for example, to a different carrier that will give us better success.
Yeah, and I think too, I was just thinking of a couple customers I have that the reason why we maybe see this so prevalent in the marketplace is that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. A lot of our customers have leveraged the hybrid design instead of replacing their entire telephony infrastructure, simply providing DR or overflow capability. So if you had a PRI that was providing your primary sending and receiving, but at once a month it gets filled up because you have a large outbound event that occurs. We do have customers that will deploy the hybrid architecture and only utilize it for if the PRI service is down or if it's filled up and at a peak, so to provide that overflow service. So a lot of flexibility in how this gets deployed, and one of the reasons I think we see so many customers that are leveraging it today.
David and Juan, we had a quick question come in regarding this. I thought I'd interject real quick, which I think is timely. Somebody had asked, they use different fax servers in different divisions of the company, and would hybrid faxing be a solution for those disparate fax servers?
Juan, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we have integrations with multiple fax applications. We've actually had customers who work on very large consolidation projects, whether it's through mergers and acquisitions. And a lot of times the hybrid solution works well because they're implementing and integrating, for example, multiple networks into one. So that way they maintain the fax server and all of the domains internally, but on the telephony side, it gives them a great big flexibility with multiple carriers. And for example, in this case where they may have phone numbers in multiple regions, consolidating those all into one.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Juan. So let's talk about the hosted cloud faxing option. This would be kind of comparing it to the hybrid option. You would not have the fax server on premise anymore. So the general thought here is that you remove everything you have on premise that you use today and simply use a fully hosted cloud service to do all of your sending and receiving. A lot of times in this, for these solutions, you're doing that sent from the desktop either via email. A lot of times it's phone number at and then the fax services domain. Or many of them also offer a web-based browser client, which is very similar to the on-premise thick clients that you see. Some of them have some limited functionality. Others, I'd say, more fully mimic what an on-premise client would look like. But again, the big benefit here is you're eliminating the fax server, all of the transmission costs associated with the phone lines and PBXs and gateways, and then, of course, the loss of the administration and maintenance cost. So all of that gets handled for you. And then also from a scalability standpoint, because those services are typically structured on a per page basis, you are not left having to figure out how many channels do you need in order to support your volumes. They will simply scale with you during periods where you have heavy inbound or if you have large outbound events that need to go out. The key when we look at these hosted fax services, I would say, is looking at flexible contracts is probably one of the biggest ones. Some service providers will require a long-term service agreement up front before you begin using their service. I would view that as a red flag. What we have found from working with many different cloud fax service providers is that the ones that offer the shorter-term contracts are essentially saying to their customers, if we're not doing what you're paying us to do, you can leave. And when a provider requires a long-term contract up front before you've really ever used their service, it's just something I think we've seen you should be cautious about a little bit, because in certain circumstances, we've seen customers that have entered those agreements and then they spend the entire time waiting for the end date to come so that they can use something else. So I think that's a key piece. I would look for ones that will give you that flexibility. A lot of times even they may charge you a higher rate for the flexibility, but if you wanted to do that at the beginning just to make sure that it's up to snuff and it's meeting all of your needs, that's still not a bad idea. Additionally, from the encryption and compliance part that we talked about earlier, if you have specific needs, I would say show me the paper. Make sure that you see the credentials and the certifications, and try to avoid self-certified statements that someone may use to tell you what security levels they have. Of course, carrier-grade equipment. I'd say if you're looking in the enterprise space, you want to look for a reputable provider that can definitely meet the needs of whatever your volumes and reporting requirements are and service levels. And then integration services. That is a big differentiator we've seen in the enterprise space, where if you're coming from a heavily or a very heavily utilized on-premise system that is touching multiple applications, some of the cloud providers can accommodate on some very basic manners for those applications, and others have full development teams, can work with you to redesign, write to their new APIs, make sure you're getting all the reporting and statuses that you need. So I would spend some time there if that's a requirement for your organization, for sure. So I want to talk a little about who this would ideally be suited for again. This would be for the customer that obviously doesn't want to maintain their on-premise infrastructure, but that you would want the fax server-like experience. You just don't want to be having to maintain it and run it. Also, I put a bullet in here for not having long-term retention requirements for faxes, and Juan talked a little bit about this during his section on the transition. It's very uncommon that we see customers migrate their historical fax data into a new cloud system. The primary reason for that is that many of the cloud providers will have limited retention periods for how long you can store the faxes in their system, or if they don't have a limited retention schedule, they will charge you for how long they keep your faxes. And if you're going to keep them there for a long period of time, those costs would have to be factored into the cost analysis if you know that that's going to be a requirement. Additionally, if just from a retention standpoint, if your plan is not to keep them in the cloud fax service system, but you do need to maintain them, I think a really important section to have a conversation with all the providers is, well, how can they get those out? Can they offload them to you so that you can keep them locally for the 5 or 10 years, whatever your retention schedule may be for certain users? And then, of course, are you comfortable with a whole new platform? A lot of times, even with many of those systems we work with today, the cloud version of an existing on-premise system may not be the same interface. And so if you're really looking to preserve that, I think you got to be very careful with what you select there. Most of the cloud platforms have a different interface, a different client experience for how you would interface with sending and receiving. Again, with Fax, a lot of the functionality is very standard as far as what you're going to do. There's only so many ways you can send or receive a fax, but be aware of the new look and feel and someone having a new interface presented to them for those same capabilities. And then the last piece I would say here is if you have a legacy on-premise system, if you have a server that you've had for a long time and are looking at, hey, it's time for us to do the upgrade and we're considering moving to the new platform, that's really a great time where we see most of our customers say, well, let me evaluate both. What would it be if I just got rid of this and went to the cloud versus what is it going to cost me to upgrade? What new benefits am I going to get from upgrading if I do that? So for a lot of our customers, when you're doing that exercise, it's a perfect time to take a look at the cloud and see if it's the right time to leverage it, either with the hybrid design or fully hosted, move everything off premise. And of course, the benefits there are obvious from the cost that you would be able to save. So which solution would be right for you? I think this boils down to a couple key categories here of, are you doing production fax? Essentially, do you have application-based systems that are sending and receiving that you need to accommodate integrations for? Your fax volumes, if you are high volume versus low volume, I think that's a key consideration for which service might be best. And then obviously the compliance certifications, not everyone has the exact same credentials for what they can certify having compliance for. And then the last one I would say is the desktop faxing component. Again, as I mentioned on the last slide, some of the solutions provide very similar fax server-like interfaces, which even if it is a whole new system, would be very easy to understand exactly how to send and receive and check your phone books, everything you would be used to in your existing system. But I think that's a key component because some of the services do provide more email-based sending. And for users that are used to having a print driver or working within the client and then composing the fax there, that could be a pretty big change, just kind of depending on what the service is that we're looking at. And Juan, again, I was going to ask you here for a minute before we move on. I know we've deployed a lot of fully hosted cloud customers, especially coming from legacy fax server environments. Is there anything you kind of want to add here from having made this transition for other customers or other points that might be noteworthy?
Sure, I'll make a point. Actually, you were talking about the desktop experience and it being a different interface. What we've actually found with customers is they've actually found it very welcoming because it's a updated web-based type of interface that gives you a lot more flexibility. The printer driver capabilities are similar and directly integrate to the cloud solution. So even though it is a different interface, it does give you a lot of benefits. Eliminating that day-to-day administration of the on-premise solution, particularly as we know, the versions of SQL, Windows, Office are constantly changing, and customers are constantly having to keep up with that. So in this, you're basically really moving overall all of that functionality over to the hosted solution. You don't have to worry about those components anymore, really lowering your internal IT costs for this.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, so let's talk about the last option, the direct fax integration. This is really, I almost say, a subset of the fully hosted option, but we break it out for a specific reason. This would be for customers really that do not do the desktop faxing and have primarily it's an electronic health record system. Maybe it's a homegrown application or your financials, SAP or Oracle. And that is the primary reason you have your fax server, is to allow that system to be able to send and receive faxes. So we have had a lot of interest in this recently where customers are basically deciding, I don't really need the fax server because the desktop faxing use is minimal or non-existent. And so this integration really gives you the capability of taking that application and directly integrating it to the carrier. Again, as I talked about earlier in the presentation, the big benefit here is reducing the points of failure, which in a traditional fax server deployment are many, because of all of the different components required to make a fax server function in its entirety. So a lot of customers look at this with having really tremendous cost savings, because you're eliminating all of the software and hardware, the maintenance, support, the phone lines, all of the administration associated to the fax server, when it's only providing one function, which is to allow your key application or core application the ability to send and receive. Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier about the more intelligence and getting those statuses and notifications and reporting back. Again, a lot of times when you're directly integrated to the carrier, that information is more robust and it comes quicker. So we've seen higher service levels of a system being able to do that sending and receiving when using the direct fax integration. Again, who would this ideally be suited for? I think it's the customers that don't have those desktop faxing needs, or for customers where the application fax traffic is the most critical, most important part of the system. And a lot of times we'll look at deploying high availability or disaster recovery scenarios in order to make sure that that application can continue to send and receive or withstand an outage in the fax server environment. But that gets very costly, as you have to have all of the infrastructure of the fax server in 2 different or more locations. So I think a lot of times if that's kind of the realm that your business is in, it makes a lot of sense for this direct fax integration component, especially to increase the reliability and reporting capabilities. Juan, I know we've done this with a couple customers as well. Do you want to share or mention anything specific to the direct fax integration component?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also had a question particularly in how to integrate, a solution, as you mentioned here, which is custom built or an in-house type of application. A lot of the partners that we work with here and solutions are have very feature-rich APIs and give you the capability. One of the things that we've been very impressed with some of our partners is that they've actually created a library of API commands that you can utilize and take advantage, so you don't have to start that from the very beginning or from scratch. We also have a great amount of support for that initial integration and walking you through that, and provide test accounts where you can implement the solution in a test environment and then bring it into production. These direct integrations have really benefited from, again, we're getting rid of that fax server so that you don't have the dependency on the fax server anymore, and the direct integration gives you that high availability, the availability of high capacity of channels without making that internal investment. And the notifications back to the applications with these direct integrations have also been very well received by our customers, where they're able to submit the job, they get the statuses back successfully, and really implement that solution without having that dependency at their on-premise servers.
Yeah, I was thinking, Juan, another area that I've seen with customers recently is if you have an application that's not a custom in-house one, but one that you've purchased for a specific reason, a lot of times those manufacturers or software providers will have a list of, we support this fax server and that fax server. And for a lot of our customers, they'll look at that and say, well, I don't want either. I don't want any fax server, or I don't want one of those fax servers. And so I think this is also a great option where if you have one of those solutions and you're not interested in running a full-blown fax server just to allow that system to be able to send and receive, this becomes a great alternative to have it directly connect to a carrier and eliminate all of that extra infrastructure.
Certainly.
For sure. And then
and
I
David,
saw
we also
another
had
question.
another. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I saw it. Do you want to mention that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of outbound integration versus inbound, and you may be able to answer this as well, David, but basically you're paying for what you utilize there in terms of the outbound faxing. If you don't have any receiving faxes that you're doing, you obviously won't pay for that volume. In addition to that, there won't be any cost in terms of inbound DADs that you may have in an inbound solution. So there are some cost benefits if you're only utilizing outbound, where you don't have that additional inbound DAD cost.
Yeah, I would agree. definitely can have some huge savings there if it's outbound only. And likewise, we also have customers that just use it for inbound only too. So either way you're sending or receiving, again, because of the never busy inbound service, a lot of times customers say, I just want it for that so I don't have to worry about my customers ever getting a busy signal if they, are trying to fax in their insurance forms or whatever they may be doing. So great. So let's, to wrap it up, just a quick summary here of the key considerations. I think security and compliance is probably one of the biggest ones, and understanding your organization's need for those. Again, as I mentioned before, I would say ask for the paper if it's really a requirement. And if it's not a requirement and it's a nice to have, I'd say just be prepared that some of the providers that go through all of the testing and certifications and paperwork to get those certifications in writing, they may charge a higher rate for that because it is a very time-consuming and costly venture for the providers to get those certifications completed. Location of data centers could be a big point for a lot of our customers. We have some service providers that have Canada only or US only, as well as international presence. So again, if that's a requirement, kind of along the same level of security and compliance, make sure to ask about that. The contract flexibility is probably one of the bigger ones that I think is important, especially as you're onboarding. But it's usually a good indicator of if the vendor is standing behind the service levels that they're going to be providing for this. Of course, usability and visibility, SLAs and uptime, that is a very big one. And the important part with the SLAs and uptimes, I would say, is making sure that if they miss those, are you fully aware of what the recourse is, and making sure that it's not something minor, but something that would be significant or at least corresponding to the time of outage that you've experienced. But excellent. So Julie, I think that concludes my part of it. If you'd like to move on to Q&A, if we have some time.
Thank you so much, David and Juan. I really appreciate the information and time today. So thank you so much for this in-depth presentation. And I also appreciate, I see you guys were keeping on top of the questions as they came in. And so I think we've answered almost all of them. We had several questions that came in regarding custom integrations or integrations to custom applications. I think we covered off on all of those. We had a question just come in recently about international faxing, and David, I think you just addressed that in the last slide. That's kind of a determining factor on what solution would be the best for you, depending on how much international faxing you do. We are about 3 minutes over our time, and so there's only a couple of questions that were left unanswered. I think they're kind of specific to these individual environments, so we may save those and reach out to you directly to get the information you need. But real quick, I do see a question regarding sharing the slides. Absolutely. Everybody on the line today will be getting an email from us shortly with a link to this recorded webinar. So you will have this full presentation in its entirety. So with that, I want to be sensitive to everybody's time, and thank you all very, very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you spending this hour with us. And of course, if you have any other questions, if there's any more information we can provide for you, please do not hesitate to reach out to us using the information on your screen. So with that, I'll wish you all a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.